Something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that most people will never see on a headline ticker, yet it may prove far more important than the loudest crisis speeches coming out of Washington, because beneath the smoke, beneath the official statements, and beneath the carefully worded denials, a much bigger question has quietly entered the room. If a commercial tanker can be hit in one of the most closely watched waterways on Earth, and if that strike can ripple through insurance markets, shipping routes, oil prices, military planning, and public confidence all at once, then the real story is no longer about one ship, but about whether the entire system that protects global trade is beginning to crack. And that is why this moment matters. Because when a superpower starts looking vulnerable in the one region where it has promised stability for decades, the consequences do not stay local, they spread outward, fast, and they eventually reach every country, every market, and every household that depends on predictable energy and predictable power. Before I go any further, I want to say something directly. Because I put real effort into breaking down these developments, tracking the news, connecting the dots, and presenting it in a way that actually makes sense. And honestly, it feels painful when people watch, stay silent, never like, never subscribe, never share, and still expect the work to keep coming. I reply to comments because I respect the audience, I pay attention to the questions because I care about the discussion. And if this channel has ever given you value, then I'm asking you sincerely to support Market Mindset and also follow the backup channel Market Mindset 2 so this community keeps growing and the work does not disappear into silence. Now let us go back to the story, because the real tension begins when you understand that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water, it is one of the most strategic pressure points on the planet, a passage so small on the map, yet so massive in consequence that a single disruption can shake energy markets across continents. At its narrowest point, the strait is only a few dozen kilometers wide. But through that corridor flows a huge share of the world's oil and fuel traffic, which means every ship that passes through it is not just carrying cargo, it is carrying stability, expectation, and the fragile confidence that global commerce will keep moving without interruption. For years, the basic assumption was simple, because the United States Navy and its allies would act as the shield over that corridor. And as long as that shield remained credible, shipping companies could plan, insurers could calculate, and governments could pretend that the energy lifeline of the world was safe enough to ignore. But assumptions only matter until reality begins to test them, and what seems to be happening now is that reality is testing them in the most expensive way possible, by forcing the world to ask whether the protector is still able to protect, whether the deterrent still deters, and whether the old order still commands the fear it once did. That is where the drone issue becomes so serious, because this is no longer a debate about old weapons or old tactics. It is about modern systems, modern surveillance, modern air defense, and the uncomfortable possibility that cheap, flexible, asymmetric tools can now force even the most advanced militaries to operate under pressure. When reports suggest that sophisticated drones and related systems are being challenged or neutralized in a real combat environment, the message sent to the world is bigger than one engagement, because it says the battlefield has changed, the cost equation has changed, and the advantage that once belonged automatically to the strongest power may no longer be automatic. That is exactly why analysts pay such close attention when a high-value aircraft, especially one like an F-35, is even mentioned in the same breath as a contested theater, because that aircraft is not just metal and software. It is a symbol of technological superiority, a symbol of strategic confidence, and a symbol of how America has projected its reach for decades. If that symbol starts looking less invincible, even in a narrow and highly specific theater, then every military planner in every capital starts recalculating. Because credibility is never built only on what you own, it is built on what others believe you can actually use and defend when the moment turns dangerous. And that brings us to the political layer of this story, which may be even more explosive than the military one, because when leaders begin floating language that sounds like resource seizure, strategic redistribution, or control over another nation's energy assets, the world does not hear diplomacy, it hears power stripped of its mask. That is the kind of statement that does not simply stay in the room where it was said, because it changes how allies listen, how rivals react, and how neutral countries interpret the real intentions behind public policy, especially when the subject is oil, sovereignty, and a region already carrying decades of mistrust. For generations, the strongest countries tried to wrap their strategic interests in legal language, institutional language, and diplomatic language, because even when the underlying goals were ruthless, the appearance of restraint helped preserve legitimacy. But once that language begins to disappear, the world starts seeing the raw machinery underneath. And once the raw machinery is visible, the reaction is immediate, especially among governments that have spent years watching how sanctions, financial pressure, naval presence, and currency power can all be used together to shape the behavior of others without firing a conventional shot. That is why the financial side of this story is just as important as the military side, because if energy starts moving outside the dollar system, if trade settlements begin shifting into yuan or other alternative arrangements, and if more states quietly reduce their dependence on American clearing mechanisms, then the foundation of power itself begins to shift. The petrodollar system did not become powerful by accident because it created a loop in which oil demand supported dollar demand. Dollar demand supported American borrowing power. And that borrowing power in turn allowed the United States to sustain influence on a scale few countries could ever match. When that loop is even partially interrupted, the consequences are not dramatic for one day and then over. They are cumulative, then accelerating, and then suddenly obvious, because once one country starts diversifying, another follows, and then a third decides it is safer not to depend on the old system at all. That is how slow erosion becomes structural change. And structural change is exactly what the powerful fear most, because it is not a headline, it is a drift. And by the time leaders admit the drift is real, the damage has already spread through markets, alliances, and public confidence. So let us step back and look at the strategy behind the chaos. Because what Iran appears to be doing is not trying to win a direct war in the traditional sense, but trying to make the cost of pressure so high, so unpredictable, and so politically painful that the stronger side eventually begins to hesitate. That is asymmetric warfare in its purest form, because the point is not to mirror the enemy ship for ship, jet for jet, or dollar for dollar. The point is to create a battlefield where every expensive move by the bigger power can be answered by a cheaper move from the smaller one. In that kind of conflict, one drone, one strike, one disruption, or one threat can force insurance hikes, rerouted cargo, emergency meetings, press conferences, market reactions, and military alerts, which means the ripple effect becomes the weapon, not just the explosion itself. That is why even the rumor of vulnerability can be strategically devastating, because power is not only measured by firepower, it is measured by confidence. And once confidence starts slipping, every adversary becomes more curious, every ally becomes more cautious, and every neutral actor starts looking for a backup plan. This is also why the reaction from global markets is so important, because oil prices do not move only on barrels, they move on fear, expectation, and the possibility that ships may have to pay more to move, insurers may have to charge more to cover risk, and consumers may eventually have to absorb the cost. When shipping becomes more expensive, energy becomes more expensive. When energy becomes more expensive, everything built on energy becomes more expensive. And when that process continues long enough, the inflation does not feel geopolitical anymore. It feels personal, because it shows up in transport, food, bills, and daily life. In the United Kingdom, that means higher pressure on households already sensitive to energy volatility. Because a disruption in the Gulf is never just a foreign policy story for Britain, it becomes a cost of living story, a political story, and a story about how quickly distant instability can become local frustration. In the United States, the danger is equally sharp, because Americans notice petrol prices immediately, and no president wants to explain why foreign policy strength is producing domestic pain, especially when voters are already skeptical, already tired, and already watching for signs that leadership is slipping. In Canada, the implications still matter deeply, because energy markets influence provincial revenues, employment, trade balances, and fiscal planning, which means a long period of Gulf instability is not some distant headline. It becomes part of the economic weather system that affects decisions at home. And then there is the human side that news clips often rush past, because when aircraft go missing, personnel are unaccounted for, and families wait for updates, the story stops being strategic abstraction and becomes something much heavier, something lived by people who never asked to become part of a geopolitical calculation. Those are the moments that reveal the true weight of these decisions, because a briefing room can turn a conflict into language, but a family waiting for a call turns it back into reality, and reality is always more expensive than rhetoric. Meanwhile, the countries watching from the sidelines are not simply standing still, because many of them are already building insurance strategies of their own, diversifying trade relationships, expanding non-dollar settlement options, and quietly making sure they are not trapped if the regional order keeps wobbling. That should tell you everything about the mood of the moment, because when allies start preparing for a future where they cannot fully rely on the old guarantees, the issue is no longer whether the guarantees exist on paper, it is whether anyone still believes they will hold under pressure. And once belief starts moving, everything moves with it, because markets are belief, alliances are belief, deterrence is belief, and even the most powerful military in the world depends partly on the assumption that its presence will be enough to prevent the worst outcomes before they begin. That is the deeper crisis inside this story, not whether America still has power, because of course it does, but whether the world still sees that power as decisive, reliable, and worth fearing in the exact places where fear once kept the system stable. If the answer becomes less certain, then more actors will test the line, more governments will hedge their bets, more shipping firms will demand protection premiums, more investors will price in instability, and more rivals will decide that the old rules have become negotiable. That is how international order changes, not always through one dramatic collapse, but through repeated tests, repeated doubts, repeated calculations, and repeated moments where the cost of enforcing the old system looks heavier than the cost of challenging it. This is why the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is a live referendum on who really sets the terms of the global economy, who can interrupt the flow, who can absorb the punishment, and who can still command obedience when pressure rises. Every tanker that enters that passage is now more than a ship, because it is a test case, a signal, and a measure of how much risk the system can tolerate before fear itself starts becoming the market price. And the most dangerous part is that these transitions are rarely clean, because when an old order begins to weaken, but a new one has not yet fully emerged, the gap between perception and reality becomes the most volatile space on Earth. In that gap, small misjudgments can trigger larger ones, local events can become global shocks, and leaders can find themselves trapped between appearing weak if they restrain themselves, or appearing reckless if they escalate too far. That is why this moment deserves attention, because what looks like a regional incident may actually be a preview of how the next era of power will be negotiated, tested, and contested in public. So the real question is not whether one tanker was hit, because that is only the visible event. The real question is whether the world is beginning to learn that the cost of challenging power is no longer as predictable as it once was. If that belief keeps spreading, then the consequences will reach far beyond the Gulf, because once credibility weakens in one strategic theater, the rest of the world starts asking where else the old guarantees may already be fraying. And if more countries begin pricing oil outside the dollar, if more partners begin hedging instead of following, and if more institutions begin treating American protection as conditional rather than certain, then the entire architecture of the system starts to look less permanent than it once did. That does not mean collapse, but it does mean renegotiation, and renegotiation between great powers is rarely gentle, rarely clean, and rarely contained to the place where it begins. It spreads through shipping lanes, through bank desks, through election speeches, through military planning rooms, and through the quiet decisions made by governments that would rather not be caught on the wrong side of history when the balance shifts. So watch the Strait closely, because what happens there is no longer only about Iran, no longer only about the United States, and no longer only about oil. It is about whether the world is entering a phase where power must be proven again and again instead of merely announced. And if that is the direction history is moving, then every move from here onward will matter more than the last, because in times like these, one strike can change markets, one statement can move alliances, and one moment can expose how fragile the old order really is. Now, I want to hear your opinion, because the only way to understand where this story goes next is to hear how you read it, whether you think American credibility in the Gulf can still be restored, or whether something fundamental has already changed for good. And if the petrodollar system keeps weakening, and if more countries start settling oil outside the dollar, then what do you think that means for ordinary people in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and across the wider world? Because this is the kind of shift that eventually reaches everyone. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of issue that deserves real debate, not empty slogans and not surface-level reactions. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, then please like this video, share it with someone who follows global affairs, comment your opinion below, and subscribe to Market Mindset so you do not miss the next deep analysis. And do not forget to stay connected with Market Mindset and Market Mindset 2, because the story is changing fast, the stakes are rising, and the next move could reshape everything.